Good afternoon, all of you. The fourth edition of the India March for Science is compelled to be an online event across the country due to the COVID pandemic. We've had dozens of webinars across cities on a wide range of topics. Specifically in Karnataka, a week-long series of webinars is underway from the August 3rd on topics ranging from environment to evolution, from nuclear energy to critical thinking and role of media, from the climate change to need for basic sciences. If you have missed any of them, nothing to worry. The recordings are available on the March for Science Bengaluru Facebook page, and you can all see them. The COVID-19 pandemic has brought many issues to the fore, including the role of science and its present stage of development, the need for robust funding and support to sciences, strengthening the public healthcare system, strengthening the public education system, and so much more. To give a quick perspective on the background, the March for Science is a global movement that was organized for the first time on the Earth Day, April 22nd, 2017. Over 10 lakh people marched on the streets in over 600 cities. India joined the march on August 9th, 2017, and the event was organized in over 70 cities and towns of India with thousands of people joining across the country. The March for Science is a non-partisan movement to celebrate science that advocates robust funding to scientific research, pitches for evidence-based policies, and vouches to promote scientific temper, among many other things. The topic of this webinar, importance of the study of evolution, has unfortunately been a hotly debated topic ever since Darwin and Wallace came up with their theory of evolution way back in 1859. Thomas Huxley was called Darwin's bulldog because he fiercely argued in favor of the theory of evolution. From the 1860s to 2020s, the theory of evolution has been corroborated by repeated and irrefutable evidences, but yet has consistently run the risk of being undermined by the authorities, and so informed efforts by scientists led by Richard Dawkins, David Attenborough, and others to defend it continues even till date. Today we have a panel of eminent scientists who will present their views on the necessity and importance of the study of theory of evolution. Recently, a few chapters were removed from the CBSE syllabus to make for the academic loss due to COVID-19 pandemic, which included a chapter on evolution as well. There was a beautifully drafted letter by the Indian Society of Evolutionary Biologists written to the HRD Ministry and the chairperson of CBSE. We have with us one of the panelists, Professor Amitabh Joshi, who is also a founding member of the Indian Society of Evolutionary Biologists. One paragraph in the letter captures the essence of today's discussion, in my opinion. Ecology and evolution are central to any understanding of the living world, and indeed provide the conceptual framework within which we make sense of the amazing diversity of life forms and life processes at various levels of biological organization. Without ecology and evolution, biology would be little more than a haphazard collection of interesting but unconnected facts. As the Nobel laureate Sir Peter Mahadevan says, for a biologist, the alternative to thinking in evolutionary terms is not to think at all. With this introductory note, I take the honor of introducing the panelists to you. Professor S. Mahadevan is one of the pillars of the India March for Science movement and has made commendable efforts in taking science to people. His research interests are in the area of microbial genetics, physiology, and evolution. He has completed his BSc in Physics from the Kerala University, Thiruvananthapuram, MSc in Molecular Biology from Madurai Kamaraj University, and PhD in Molecular Biology from the Tufts University Medical School, Boston. He has been a professor at the MRDG department of IISC till recently. He was the editor of Resonance, a monthly science journal published by the Indian Academy of Sciences. He has given several popular talks on evolution, and one of them was during the 150th year of the publication of the Darwin's masterpiece Origin of Species, organized by the Breakthrough Science Society at the Raman Research Institute. He has guided several PhD students in his research career. I warmly welcome you, sir, to today's discussion. And the next of the panelists is Professor Renee Borges. She is a professor at the Center for Ecological Sciences, IISc. She has served as the chairperson of the same department up to 2016. Her PhD was from the University of Miami, Florida, USA in 1989. She is recipient of several honors and rewards, including being the J.C. Bose National Fellow 2016. She is the elected secretary of the Indian Academy of Sciences and has been on the editorial board of several leading journals. She has been a research advisory council member for many academic bodies, reviewer of scientific papers for over 45 scientific journals, reviewer of research proposals for many national and international academic bodies. Her research interests include behavioral and sensory ecology, plant-animal microbe interactions, especially ant-plant interactions, fig biology, evolution of sexual displays in plants, phytochemicals and their role in food selections by herbivores, ant mimicking spiders and floral mimicry in crab spiders, and so on. She has written more than 143 research papers. She has over 25 years of teaching experience guiding graduate, postgraduate, and PhD students. She has given over 50 public lectures on evolution, ecology, and animal-plant interaction. It's indeed a great pleasure to have you amongst us, Professor Renee. And now to one more panelist, Professor Amitabh Joshi. Professor Amitabh Joshi did his BSc in botany and MSc in genetics from the Delhi University, PhD in evolutionary genetics from Washington State University, and postdoc at the University of California, Irvine. He has been at the Evolutionary and Organismal Biology Unit of JNCASR since 1996. His research is in the broad area of evolutionary biology and population ecology. He has both experimental and theoretical work. He particularly enjoys teaching. He also has serious interests in history, philosophy, and literature. He is a recipient of the S.S. Patnakar Award in 2009 and is a founding member of the Indian Society of Evolutionary Biologists. He is a fellow of all the 3 science academies of India. He has given general talks about the importance of evolutionary biology at various places in India, and also online talks in both English and Hindi. He is also a poet in Urdu, English, and sometimes in Persian, and has recited at public and private gatherings in multiple cities in India and also in Kabul. He is a scientist with varied interests, and it's indeed an honor and welcome you on board, Professor Amitabh Joshi. Yes. Now I hand over the session to Professor Mahadevan for the introductory remarks on the topic. Over to you, Professor Mahadevan.
Good afternoon, all. Thank you, Rajani, for giving me this opportunity to introduce today's topic. You've already done a great job. So my job is actually redundant. Yes, sir?
No.
So the topic, as you saw, is the importance of studying evolution. So what is evolution? Why should we study this? One second. Can everyone see the screen now?
Not yet, sir, but you can go on reading.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the proposition of the theory of evolution by natural selection more than 150 years ago by Charles Darwin and A.R. Wallace was a momentous intellectual achievement. What's the theory all about and why is its study important? So it provides a material explanation, a mechanism for the emergence of the vast diversity of living forms on this planet. The elegance of the theory is its extraordinary simplicity, yet ironically it's one of the most misunderstood concepts. A proper understanding of the theory is crucial for all biology. In the famous words of the great biologist Dobzhansky, nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. As the theory also impinges upon many areas such as public health, a proper understanding of it is also important to all of us. For example, in today's context, understanding how pathogenic bacteria evolve resistance to an antibiotic and how a bat virus can evolve into a deadly human virus and unleash global devastation can happen only in the light of the theory of evolution. Yet there is substantial difficulty in teaching evolution at the basic level in schools and colleges. There are two main reasons for this. One, opposition from religious and ideological fundamentalists in many countries, surprisingly including countries like the United States. So in spite of its tremendous scientific advancement, there's a huge lobby that is constantly fighting teaching of evolution in the schools and colleges. And second, poor grasp of what the theory implies by a large fraction of the teaching community. So they are confused a lot. So many times they're not able to bring out the important features of what evolution stands for. The goal of today's effort is to examine how we can improve the situation and make way for a better understanding of evolution by all. So in this context, I think you'll be listening to two presentations by my colleagues, Professor Amitabh Joshi and Professor Renee Borges. They will bring up the different aspects of the problems that faces us and let us know how we can sort this out. So over to Rajani.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor Mahadevan. You've, in fact, put the entire discussion in perspective. I now hand over the next 20 or 25 minutes to Professor Amitabh Joshi to discuss on the importance of the study of evolution in a specific context to biology and the biologists. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Rajani, and thank you, Professor Mahadevan, for framing the broader issue in such elegant terms. So I would like to actually begin by asking all of you following this to indulge in a couple of small thought experiments. If we look at those areas of science that deal with the non-living world, we find that there are two broad disciplines within that we label as physics and chemistry. Now imagine that in science, the entire study of the non-living world were limited to chemistry alone, and physics miraculously disappeared from the syllabuses, from the classrooms, from much discussion in society at large. Just try to imagine what it would imply for our understanding of the non-living parts of the world or the universe if we were restricted only to chemistry and there were no physics. Okay. The second thought experiment I would like you to indulge in is imagine the science of chemistry without the periodic table and atomic theory and our understanding of atomic structure and so on and subatomic structure. So chemistry has been studied since antiquity. People observed different kinds of material substances, how they interacted with each other. But without the periodic table and atomic structure, etc., chemistry would just be a bunch of information, a set of facts that you mix this and this and a blue gas comes out, you mix that and you get an explosion. There would be no logic to it. There would be no underlying structure to the discipline of chemistry. Now, the reason I brought these two examples right at the beginning is that they exemplify to a great extent the situation with biology today, especially in India. Biology ultimately is an attempt to understand the living world. And what we need to appreciate is that in many ways, just as the sciences trying to understand the non-living world are distinctly thought of as two, chemistry and physics, in many ways, there are two very different kinds of biologies, and only one of them gets all our attention, especially in India today, whether it be in discussions in journalism, on TV, in magazines, in newspapers, or indeed in our syllabuses and classrooms. And that is what I want to elaborate upon a little bit. So why do I claim that there are actually two fairly distinct kinds of life sciences? There is of course some overlap between these two kinds of biologies, just as there is a lot of overlap between what we call physics and what we call chemistry. But the sets of questions that they address are actually reasonably different. So in biology, in any attempt to understand the living world, there are basically two very distinct kinds of questions that we seek answers to. One set of questions pertains to what we might broadly call attempts to understand how living beings are in fact living. How do the mechanics of being alive work within an organism? What are the mechanisms going on inside an organism that allow it to seem as though it is temporarily in a spatial and temporally discrete phase, avoiding the laws of thermodynamics? It only seems that way. But so what is it that makes a living thing living? This is one kind of question that is asked in biology. But there are also a set of questions of a very different kind that we need to ask when we look at the living world. If you look at the living world around you, the first thing that hits you is that there is a tremendous diversity of life forms. The entire world is not just full of one kind of species. There are all kinds of microbes, plants, animals of various kinds, vertebrates, invertebrates, bryophytes, pteridophytes, gymnosperms. There is a tremendous diversity both across groups and within groups of living forms. So we need to be able to explain, in any science that calls itself biology, needs to explain why is there so much diversity of living forms. The second thing we notice when we look around is that this diversity is not just random. There are relationships of greater or lesser similarity and divergence between different life forms. If we look at, say, a human, a dog, a fish, a butterfly, and a plant, we can fairly easily assess that the human and the dog are overall more similar to each other than either of them is to the frog. The human, dog, and frog overall are more similar to each other than either of them is to a fish or indeed an insect, and so on. So we can actually cluster life forms into hierarchical structures based on similarity, with the more similar life forms of species clustering close together and connected with others to varying distances marked by how similar they are. Indeed, this is why we have the science of classification or taxonomy in biology. And taxonomy, again, is a fairly old science. Linnaeus, who is widely regarded as one of the principal architects of modern day taxonomy, was about a century before Darwin. But interestingly, it appears to be Darwin who, for the first time, actually made the argument that the very fact that we can have a taxonomy based on patterns of differing levels of similarity across species suggests that species are related to each other by ancestor-descendant relationships. So species together, just like you can make a family tree of individuals, with the individuals being related by ancestor-descendant relationships, you can also make something analogous to a family tree for sets of species. And this was one of the many arguments that Darwin marshaled in favor of the notion that evolution occurs and species evolve from one to another through the process of organic evolution. So apart from the diversity of species, we also need to provide some explanation for the relatedness patterns that we see among species. The third feature of the living world that hits us in the face when we look at it is that species appear to be very well suited or adapted to the ecological context they live in. If you look at a bird, it has many characteristics that enable it to very effectively function and move in an aerial medium in the air. Fishes and many other species that live in the water have many characteristics that enable them to function very well in an aquatic medium in the water. So we also need to explain, in addition to the diversity and the relatedness of species, we also need to explain within biology the adaptedness of species. And these three sorts of questions are very different from the first set of questions I mentioned, which is to try to understand within a living organism, how is it alive? What are the mechanics of being alive? So these two kinds of questions broadly delineate what I refer to as there being two fairly distinct kinds of biology. The first set of questions is largely posed at the level of a single functioning individual organism, or even below that level in the structural hierarchy at the level of tissues or cells, or even increasingly at the level of molecules that are found within living systems. And so you have, broadly speaking, that half of biology is roughly represented by what we often label today as molecular biology or cellular biology. We might also call it reductionist biology, because there an underlying idea is that if you can break down a system into the smallest possible constituent parts, preferably break down the organism into the molecules that make it up, and understand what those molecules are doing and how they are interacting, then you can gain a very good understanding of the organism. Now, opposed to that view is a view that suggests that it is actually very important with complex things like organisms to take a much more holistic point of view, because everything cannot be explained at the level of the underlying small parts. And so what we broadly call ecology and evolutionary biology today encompass the other set of questions I talked about, questions that pertain to trying to understand the diversity of life forms, the relatedness of life forms, and the adaptedness of life forms. And the point I really want to stress here is that both these kinds of biology have their own intrinsic importance. But especially in India, our approach to biology in our schools and colleges, and even in popular discourse in society, has become extremely lopsided, in that we mostly only focus on reductionist or molecular and cellular biology and largely ignore ecology and evolutionary biology. And a lot of what I and Professor Renee Borges are going to talk about today is why we do so at our peril. Now, I want to digress for a moment just to exemplify this difference between reductionist biology and organismal or ecological and evolutionary biology. and ask you to consider that supposing you are planning to buy a vehicle, you are planning to buy, let's say, a two-wheeler, right? Now, there are many models and varieties of two-wheelers available on the market. And obviously, we don't just go and buy the first one that happens to be sold closest to our house. We do some research, we try to figure out what are the characteristics and qualities of the different models of two-wheeler before we make our choice. And what I'd like you to think about is what are those characteristics that we focus on when we are trying to choose the best suited two-wheeler for our needs. We look at things like the overall aesthetics, the look, the shape, the color, whatever. We perhaps look at comfort. We look at fuel efficiency. We look at safety features. We might be concerned with, if I suddenly brake on a wet monsoon road, is the two-wheeler likely to skid? And so we have all these various properties of the two-wheeler that we look at. And what I would like to draw your attention to is the fact that all these properties are vehicle level traits. They are traits that are defined and expressed at the level of the entire functioning vehicle. Safety, fuel efficiency, acceleration, braking quality, durability, all these things are vehicle level traits. When we are trying to choose a well-suited two-wheeler for our needs, we don't inquire into the chemistry of how petrol is actually burned in the chamber of the engine. We don't inquire into the physics of how transmission works or what a gearbox is or how gears work. We bother about whether the motorcycle is going to skid if I suddenly brake on a moist road. But we don't bother about the chemical composition of the polymer that the tires are made of. In other words, if we think of our vehicle as an organism, we only look at organism level traits. We only look at holistically expressed traits. We don't look at the underlying molecular biology of our vehicular organism at all. And somewhere we intuitively realize that there is no point looking into those reductionist level traits, and there is a reason why we realize that, even though it is not always explicitly clear to us. We subconsciously realize that there's no point bothering about how petrol is burnt in the chamber. It's more important to bother about fuel efficiency. Why is that? There is a very good reason for that, and the reason is that once you go to lower and lower levels of organization within the vehicle and ask questions like, what is the chemistry of petrol combustion? That chemistry is going to be essentially the same in all models of motorcycle you look at. It's not going to account for any variation from individual model to individual model. And therefore, it is irrelevant to your choice of which model suits your purpose the best. Because what you want is a combination of characteristics that A, suits your budget, and B, that is suitable for the kind of use you have in mind. If you are mostly planning to do cross-country highway driving, you might be interested in a different set of properties to look for in a model that you will buy, compared to if you are planning to do most of your driving inside an old city area. It's exactly the same when you are trying to understand the living world and why there is so much diversity of organisms, because nature, through the metaphorical means of natural selection, evaluates different models, different species, according to how much resources they have, which they can devote to different characteristics or traits, and the ecological context within which they need to function, within which they need to survive and reproduce. And once again, at the molecular level, what happens inside the mitochondrion of one species is pretty much the same thing that happens inside the mitochondrion of some very different species. At the underlying molecular level, most living things do more or less the same things. And therefore, if you want to understand why this species is so different from that species, for example, the answer is not going to be found at the underlying molecular level. It's going to be found at the organismal level, and by evaluating how those organismal level traits contribute to the manner in which that organism functions within the ecological context that it inhabits. Now, another point that I would like to make, and again, this notion is not new to us. It's just that somehow when it comes to biology, we have started believing for the last 25 or 30 years that every important, consequential, meaningful explanation has to be at the molecular level. But there is no reason why that should be so. Consider again an example from physics. Strange though it may seem, academic physicists have spent quite a lot of time studying certain Brazilian football players and their ability to do miraculous things with the football in long distance free kicks. There are actually published papers in the physics literature analyzing, for example, free kicks taken by Roberto Carlos, the Brazilian fullback who also played for Real Madrid in the Spanish league. Now, when a physicist evaluates how Roberto Carlos is able to make the ball curve audaciously around the wall of defenders and completely bamboozle the goalkeeper and go to the opposite corner of the goal, they don't sit around and try to analyze in great detail the dynamics of every single atom or molecule that makes up the football and every single molecule that makes up the air that fills the inside of the football. They could do that if they wanted to, but it doesn't help in understanding the dynamics of how the football moves in three-dimensional space. Another good example of when you realize when to ignore the underlying lower level details and focus on the ball level properties. The ball level physical properties are what are helpful to efficiently understanding why the ball moves the way it does when Roberto Carlos kicks it, and perhaps why it will not move in the similar way if somebody like me was to kick it. Okay? So very often across all disciplines of science, we focus on higher level traits and ignore lower level properties in order to get a good understanding of what's going on. But unfortunately, we forget this logic when it comes to biology, and we tend to imagine that somehow the lower level, the molecular, the cellular level explanations are the only important explanations. And this is a very big mistake, because actually most answers to really important and consequential questions in biology are not going to come at the molecular level, contrary to much popular belief. They will not. The reason we make this mistake is that we are subconsciously brought up from early childhood onwards to believe in what is often called the machine metaphor, or the idea that one can think of an organism as analogous to a machine. This is a fairly old idea. It goes back a few hundred years to the French philosopher René Descartes. And the machine metaphor we absorb when we are very young. It becomes part of our sort of almost subconscious way of thinking. But to think of an organism which is the product of an evolutionary process as a machine is extremely misleading, because a machine is something that is not the product of an evolutionary process. It's the product of an informed build from scratch process by a craftsman. They are very different things. A machine and an organism are completely different. And this is one reason, for example, why we sometimes have unrealistic expectations from doctors, because we expect a doctor to treat us the way we expect our auto mechanic to treat our car or two-wheeler. But the difference is we made the car. We know exactly how it works. And the car, all said and done, is a fairly simple piece of machinery. And exactly how it was made is known to the mechanic who has to deal with it when it starts malfunction. The doctor who is asked to treat your body when the organism is malfunctioning doesn't have the luxury of knowing exactly how your body functions, and is dealing with a far more complex system than even a car or a complex piece of machinery. Machinery is always basically simple, it's not very complex. Organisms, even the single-celled ones, are seriously complex. That is why, for example, most medical treatments, when you take medicines for something, most medicines have side effects. Whereas when your mechanic repairs your carburetor, there are no side effects on how your car brakes or on, on the amount of play in the steering wheel. Because it's a simple system, you can repair one part of the system without affecting in unknown ways other parts of the system. And that's not quite how organisms work. And the reason for this is that although we can think of a structural hierarchy within life forms, you can think of molecules and then cells and then tissues and organ systems and organisms, populations, ecological communities, ecosystems, and so on. These are hierarchical levels into which you can imagine structural aspects of the living world being organized. But the minute you start thinking about functionality in the living world, it is integrated across multiple structural scales. Functionality is not limited to one level of structural organization, and that's why organisms or living systems are indeed complex systems. Now, the problem, just to sort of sum up what I was trying to say here. So the problem, in my opinion, is that we in India, especially for the last 35, 40 years or so, are neglecting the more holistic kind of biology, the organismal level biology, ecology, evolutionary biology, the study of behavior, and so on. And we are overly emphasizing molecular and cellular biology. And increasingly, we do that because we hold up the possibility of great rewards in terms of our ability to solve problems facing society, whether agricultural, biomedical, etc. However, and this is something that I believe Professor Renee Borges will address in more detail when she speaks, that is actually not entirely true. Most of the big biologically based problems that societies face today are actually not going to be amenable to molecular or cellular level solutions, whether we like it or not. The reason we tend to favor simple molecular solutions to biomedical problems as opposed to more holistic solutions within an ecological and evolutionary framework is partly the demands of the pharmaceutical industry. If I can tell you that altering one molecule will rid you of heart disease, then I can make a drug based on that one molecule and something which will bind to that one molecule and solve your problem. But if I tell you that, there is not going to be any one molecule that you can tweak to solve this problem, you need to think about how the whole body functions in a very holistic way. You need to think about environment. You need to think about diet. You need to think about energy budgets. You need to think about all kinds of things. Then it becomes very difficult to prescribe one drug for your disease. And this is an interesting example of how often scientific understandings or deliberately limited scientific understandings can be driven by business requirements. This is sad but true. And we must realize that science, for all our claims to objectivity, doesn't function in a vacuum. Scientists are part of society. Science is functioning in society. So we need to go back and educate society. And that is why I would like to end by reminding you that biology is very broad. It addresses lower level questions such as what makes living things alive, but it also addresses higher order questions pertaining to the functioning of organisms, to the diversity of species, to the adaptedness of species, to the relatedness of species, how ecosystems work. All that is also biology, though you would be forgiven for thinking that that's some very minor part of biology if you look at our textbooks and our syllabuses. This is something that needs to change. There needs to be a clamor from society that we want the syllabuses to change to reflect biology properly. We don't want a living sciences curriculum that is only teaching one living science and not the other. We don't want a curriculum for biology that is like having a curriculum which excludes physics and only teaches chemistry. This voice has to come from society at large. Then the curricula will change. And the last thing I want to stress is that evolutionary biology is not a sub-discipline of biology the way biochemistry is, or microbiology is, or anatomy is, or physiology is. Evolutionary biology is a perspective. It is a perspective from which you can meaningfully view and make sense of phenomena in every area of biology at every level of structural organization in biology, from the smallest molecules to the largest ecosystems. It is a perspective. It is almost, evolutionary biology is almost like saying biology, but we tend to have forgotten that. And this is something that we need to change, because otherwise, if we continue teaching our students this lopsided reductionist biology as if it was the only thing that mattered in the life sciences, we are basically doing them a grave disservice. As students of biology, we are depriving them from half of biology, which in many ways is the more important half of biology. I will stop here. Thank you very much for your patience, and thanks to the organizers for giving me this chance to share my views. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Amitabh. It was indeed a very insightful 20 minutes. You've brought on very relevant points about how evolutionary biology is a perspective in which the entire biological world makes sense, and also about the lopsided view of the syllabus that is being taught. I, having taught biology for almost 12 years in the colleges, would relate to these sentiments that you have spoken today. Now to the next speaker of the noon, Professor Renee Borges. She's going to speak on the importance of evolution in a general perspective on our day-to-day life. Over to Professor Renee Borges.
Thank you. I'm trying to share my screen here. Is my screen visible?
Yes, your screen is visible.
Is my screen? Okay, okay. Thank you very much, Rajani and Breakthrough Society in India March for Science. I'm very happy to actually, Amitabh and Professor Mahadevan before me have set the stage for, putting biology into a broader perspective. So this is Darwin when he was young and Darwin when he was older. And of course, Amitabh has already said, and others before him, that we work with the foundations that were laid by eminent evolutionary biologists like Charles Darwin. Now, Amitabh also mentioned a tree of life or relationships and how organisms are related to each other. And Darwin, and this is from Darwin's notebook of 1837, where you see that he was already thinking about how organisms are related to each other. And here, Darwin was a pigeon fancier. And you can see that from the very simple, domestic pigeon, people were breeding all sorts of fabulous and new life forms, which which had not existed on the planet before people started what is called artificial selection. Observing and also engaging in artificial selection, which gave him many insights about how the diversity of life on Earth must be connected and interrelated with each other. Similarly, we know today that agriculture and agricultural scientists are doing this all the time. I just put up a very sort of an iconic image of how in the family Brassicaceae, which gives us the cabbage and the cauliflower and broccoli and so many different forms, all of which is really just coming from selection, and in this case it's artificial selection, that's coming from different parts of the plant. So if you select for buds, terminal buds, you get a cabbage. If you select for flower clusters, you will get a cauliflower. If you select for both stems and flowers, you get another form. So this is similar to what Professor Joshi, Amitabh was telling you. It really depends on what is the overall selection. Are you selecting for a fast car, a slow car, something that's going to skid, not skid? What is the ultimate goal of the selection? Yes? We are all familiar with dogs, and I like this example again because it shows us how from a common ancestor, which people believe is the grey wolf, humans have bred all sorts of shapes and sizes of dogs. You get the little Chihuahua over here and the huge giant Great Dane, which is, many, many, many times bigger and larger and stronger and maybe even fiercer than this little Chihuahua. This again shows us the power and the ability of, if you think about it here, artificial selection, of humans doing the selection, but all the life forms that we have on the earth today are really what natural selection has brought about. So natural selection gave us the grey wolf over many, many millennia of, selecting from different organisms, giving us mammals, giving us different other types of species, gave us the grey wolf, and then from the grey wolf we have got, all these myriad of types of dogs that we see. Now, somebody might ask, we now also have, for example, the Dog Genome Project, which is very interesting because we know that humans share many, many similarities in terms of behavior, aggression, affection, types of live, etc., etc. And now there is a very serious attempt to look for certain traits in dogs and then try and see, because the genomes of all these different forms have been sequenced, we can pick out genes that might be responsible for traits in dogs and then try and relate them to the same traits in human beings. And this is a very big project being run all the world today. It was coordinated at the National Institute of Health in the USA. So as the speakers before me have talked about it, we have a connectedness, which is what Darwin saw, Darwin put down in his drawings of these trees. And in life, we can see that, what percent of genes do we share? So we share about 18% of genes with plants, 26% of genes with yeast, 44% of our genes are in the fruit fly, 92% of our genes we have in common with mice, and with the chimpanzee we have 98% commonality of genes. Now, this is very important because this means that there is a connection, there is a continuity from the beginning of life on Earth And with new techniques, we are able to actually determine what this percentage and connectivity, what this actually means. Now, how is all of this? So Joshi also told us and told you that we need to look at, when he was talking about or I think he used the example of the two-wheeler, and he said, maybe if you have a certain attribute in your two-wheeler, you may not be able to get another attribute. Everything is right. Only this pay for your two-wheeler, it's money, maybe the size of your two-wheeler, the size of your wheel, and so on and so forth. So similarly, in evolution, we have trade-offs. We have trade-offs between traits. Now, all of us are very concerned about viruses and transmission of viruses. So I thought I'd use this example where, for example, there is a trade-off between the virulence of the virus versus the transmissibility of the virus. So if the virus is very virulent, makes you really very sick, so that you can't get out of your bed, obviously then you will not be encountering people and there will be less chance for the virus to be transmitted. If the virus is less virulent, so that you are out there running around and you sneeze and cough or do whatever, the virus will have more chance for transmission. So here too you can see trade-offs being operated in evolution. Again, I'm using an example of our coronavirus because it's occupying most of our mental space these days. And much before the coronavirus came on the scene, you can see this is in 2015, there was a paper published in Science which really talked about the family tree of all the viruses, including now and the bacteria. Eukarya are the eukaryotic organisms, which includes you and everybody else, eukaryotes, and then the archaea. And such trees are very important to us today, because if we are we want to understand where did this virus come from, how closely is related to other viruses. So the best guess that we have right now is that if we say that, this is an evolutionary time, and we've got viruses that are in bats, and we have viruses possibly in pangolins, and then we have another virus in bats, and maybe this then went on to get into viruses in people in China from where the epidemic actually started. So now here people are very concerned. They're coming up with possible scenarios for how did this virus actually get into humans and is causing such a difficulty for us today. So this is from the Thailand Medical News recently. Two possible scenarios. These are bats. This is the virus sitting in bats. And maybe, the virus in bats is not is perhaps able to get into animal cells like bats. And you can see the virus is attaching here and trying to get in, but it couldn't get into human cells. But then maybe there were some mutations which accumulated. So finally then, with mutations being accumulated, these mutated viruses then, which came from bats, got into humans, and now we have the broad level of transmission. Another scenario is maybe, and we do know, there are asymptomatic carriers of viruses, even with SARS-CoV-2. And maybe later, maybe this happened even earlier, in 2013, people are now trying to trace it back. This is a short span in human evolution, but it's a very long span in virus evolution. Because as you know, viruses mutate and have many, many, many generations in, say, from 2013 to 2019. So in this scenario, you could have had many mutations allowing for increased virulence, which then has now started infecting human cells, and then you've got broad transmission. The point being made over here is that we have different hypotheses, and the only way that we can differentiate between these different hypotheses is that if we actually accumulate data, which will then enable us to test one hypothesis against the other. I turn now to cancer, because cancer is something that also occupies our mental space a lot. SARS-CoV-2 is occupying most of our mental space, but we do know that cancer has been very important for human populations. Now, it's important to also understand that all genes that are involved in the cancer proliferation are also genes that are often important in very vital processes, like, let's say, cell migration, cell cycle, etc. Now, we know that mutations that cause cancer will disrupt these controls on the cell cycle. Now, people also believe that sometimes cancer is caused because the gene, which may have had a very good effect early on in human lives, might actually have a very bad effect later on in life. What does this mean? This means that we had a gene which has multiple effects, very important to give us some important good results early on prior to reproduction, but then later on this gene also has some bad effects. So now once again we have a trade-off. Maybe we can't get rid of this gene because it's good for us before we have reproduced, but it's bad for us later. So the consequence of this is the longer we live, the more likely we are going to have late manifesting cancers, especially after we have reproduced, because natural selection is really blind to what is happening after reproduction. Because, we have passed on our genes, so natural selection is not so concerned about what's happening after the reproductive events. So actually, a lot of late-acting cancers happen later in an individual's life after we have reproduced. So this is an important perspective on the natural history of cancer, if I were to use this term. Today we know that people are also studying the evolution of cancer within an individual. So here you have, normal cells. You might get a tumor cell, one type of tumor cell which gives rise to one clone of cancer cells. You might get another mutation which gives you another tumor cell, and you can actually have competition and selection happening between these clones. So there is actually clonal propagation and clonal selection, and these tumor clones are actually competing with each other within our bodies. So this is another very important perspective on how within clones of cancer, there could be selection processes occurring. So therefore, people even started making phylogenies of cancer clones within a tumor. So this is the normal cell or the normal tissue, and then you get what is called a primary tumor. And then you can draw a tree of even tracking the individual mutations, which then gave rise to a very aggressive cancer, which is now spreading throughout the body. So this again, people are now actually looking at the ecology of cancer within an individual's body. So how is cancer progressing in different organs? What is the ecosystem of the body within which selection is occurring? So cancer research will really benefit from a Darwinian framework of understanding the competition that might be occurring within the body ecosystem. If we have a Darwinian approach to cancer, this might provide better therapeutics, and actually doctors need to be trained in evolutionary biology. This is also a big lacuna in higher level syllabi and higher level curricula. Everybody should be trained and have a good perspective on evolution. And it is for this reason that there is now a whole new branch of science called evolutionary medicine. And this was also fueled by a very important book that came out several decades ago. And the title of the book is The New Science of Darwinian Medicine. Why do we get sick? This provides a very new perspective on disease, and it even asks the question, is fever adaptive? Now, most of us, when we get fever, we want to immediately take a paracetamol and bring the fever down. But if we look at this perspective of Darwinian medicine, it asks questions, as Professor Joshi asked, us to think about, how questions and why questions. A why question would mean, why do we get fever? Which is different from how do we get fever. So a why question would be, why is fever occurring? And we now know that fever is now postulated to be an early mechanism to actually raise body temperature, which will kill many parasites. So this is believed to be a mechanism or a defense mechanism because many parasites have a very narrow window of thermal adaptation. So if you take the parasite above the thermal window, it is likely to die. So this is another very important way that we need to think about, problems like how we get sick and why we get sick. Another perspective that is very dear to my heart is put up right here in this slide for you. And this is to look at the diversity of skin color across the globe. We can see that across the globe, we vary dramatically in skin color. And this again is a question, a why question. It is also a how question in evolutionary biology. And of course, this question was raised many, many years ago in 1810. And Samuel Smith, who was the president in Princeton University, he observed this correlation. So he observed a pattern. He saw this pattern between latitude and human pigmentation. And we now know that if we sequence the chimpanzee genome, which has been sequenced, and the human genome has been sequenced, and if we compare these two genomes, we see there has been a rapid divergence of genes in epidermal differentiation between humans and chimpanzees. So this is something very important. Now, why and how? So we know that UVA, UVB, and UV ultraviolet A, ultraviolet B, and ultraviolet C are very important but often damaging parts of solar radiation. UVC is blocked by the atmosphere. So if we have a good atmosphere, UVC will be blocked. Some of UVB will come down, and a lot of UVA will also come down into below the atmosphere. It can't get blocked, and it is likely to cause a lot of oxidative damage and a lot of other not very good effects. And now scientists have been tracking the global variation in ultraviolet radiation, both of ultraviolet A and of ultraviolet B, have been looking throughout the globe at where is the most amount of these different types of ultraviolet radiations. And with this understanding, we now are in a position to really look at the selection on skin color. For example, this is light skin and this is dark skin, which has different amounts of melanin, which is produced by melanocytes. UVA, we know, causes breakdown of folic acid, and folic acid is a very important, essential component for our well-being and metabolism. Melanization of dark skin will prevent this breakdown. and in areas that get too much UVA, which is the tropical areas. However, dark skin will prevent vitamin D synthesis in areas that are receiving low amounts of UVB, which is in the temperate areas, which are in the higher latitudes. So we now know again that there is a trade-off over here, and therefore we can understand that human skin pigmentation is the product of two clines produced by natural selection to adjust the levels of constitutive melanization or pigmentation to the levels of ultraviolet radiation. Now, once we realize this, that we have inherited this and one of the most favorite molecule, which is melanin, once we realize this, I think that this question should answer itself. Yes? We are as fair and as lovely and as dark and as lovely as what is required by our adaptation brought about by natural selection. I'll just go quickly through another example because it's an example that is important and possibly something that we're very familiar with. A lot of us drink milk, and for many of us, yes, milk is meant. We can ask the question, is milk meant only for babies? In India, no. Many adults also drink milk. But in China, adult Chinese do not drink milk. In fact, they cannot drink milk. If they drink milk, they will get very, very sick. So why is this so? This is actually because of an expression of a gene, a lactase gene. And what is a lactase gene? Lactase is an enzyme which breaks down the lactose, which is the main sugar in milk. Now, normally, babies are only supposed to have milk. So babies express lactase, and therefore they can metabolize the lactose in the milk, in their mother's milk. But if you continue to drink milk even when you're grown up, we now know that in adults the expression of lactase declines. However, this decline is not in all populations. So, for example, there are hotspots of lactase. What do I mean by that? That if lactase and the expression of the lactase enzyme continues into adulthood also, such adults will still be able to drink milk and will not need to have the milk protein in the form of yogurt or any other transformed form of milk. Many of us do, convert milk into yogurt, and then we are able to consume the transformed protein, in the form of milk proteins or milk solids in yogurt. So this is again a very, very interesting pattern that one sees, but then we want to understand how did this and why did this happen. And now evolutionary biologists are talking about how migration of cattle herders from the Middle East, which, the herders that had large herds of cattle that gave excess milk, they moved from the Middle East and moved then all over the world. And consequently, this led to a selection pressure which caused the persistence of this lactase enzyme in human populations. So consequently, we now know that this lactase persists only in dairy farming communities throughout the world. When we look at hunter-gatherer communities, or for example, the Thais, the Koreans, the Chinese, the Japanese, they do not have a tradition of dairy farming, and therefore there was no selection pressure on them to have this intestinal lactase persist in adult individuals. Therefore, we now know that there is what is called gene and culture co-evolution. When we have more cattle with excess milk, there has been therefore the selection pressure to have more humans with intestinal lactase persisting into adulthood. My last example, just a couple of examples before I wrap up now. So we have the evolution of antibiotic resistance, which is really, again, a big problem in the world today. We have indiscriminately used antibiotics, and this has resulted in very fast evolution of resistant bacteria. There has been an arms race between new antibiotic discovery and the rise of resistance. So you can track it from, say, 1930 all the way down even further beyond 2010. And you can see that we've had to develop newer and newer and newer and newer drugs because the bacteria that we are exposed to are getting resistant. Even, for example, I hope all of you know Yu Tu from China, who in 2015 won the Nobel Prize for discovering this molecule artemisinin in Artemisia plants in China, which are very efficacious against the malaria parasite. But we can see that already malarial parasites are showing resistance to artemisinin. So we already got a big problem on our hands. This misuse of antibiotics is resulting in the rise of resistance in livestock, whether we are consuming chicken or any other, milk from livestock, which has been also fed indiscriminately on antibiotics. This has resulted in the evolution of resistance. Actually, the food chain has been penetrated by these antibiotics, and this is really causing a very, very serious problem to humans today. This is my last slide. We are in the era of the Anthropocene. The Anthropocene is a special era which is being described by biologists or people, scientists, which describes the Anthropocene as an era where human change is driving very, very drastic, human-induced climate change is driving very, very drastic extinctions of species. So you can see that if the environment is fluctuating past to present, there are three possibilities that species have. They can go extinct because they do not have the ability or the mutations to keep up with the pace of the environment change. They might be able to move if they have suitable habitats that they can move into where the climate is more suited to their present adaptation. They can try and become more versatile again by acquiring mutations. But all of this depends on mutations and natural selection. So, humans and species might be able to adapt or they might die out, and therefore can evolution outrun climate change? So I'm going to end here and I'm going to try and escape from this, and then perhaps we can take questions.
Thank you, Professor Renee Borges. It was indeed a very enlightening 25 minutes that we delved into cancer biology, to the patterns of lactation, to the skin color, to so many other perspectives that you threw open today. There have been a lot of questions and we are left with around 15 minutes. And so let's quickly take the questions. The first question was from one Mr. Faraz Beg. He asks, while there are people in public who appreciate the study of evolution on an average, the word importance is equated with monetary benefit technology. how do you counter this lens of looking at importance? His
Amita,
point
you should
probably
take
is, yeah. The word importance connotes.
Yeah. So let me say that I think the importance connoting technology, solving societal problems, etc., is commonly how most people interpret the importance of any scientific work. For example, uh, the public, which support scientific research through their tax monies effectively, is reasonably interested in what comes back to society in terms of technologies or solutions to societal problems. And this is a very valid concern since public money is spent on scientific research. However, when scientists talk about the importance, we are also often talking about the importance to the growth of knowledge. So, a very important scientific advance to a scientist often is one that greatly refined our understanding of some natural phenomenon, regardless of whether it actually resulted in tangible benefits to society immediately in the short term or not. So there are these two connotations, and I believe both of them are equally important in their own slightly different ways. But we should also remember that the history of the last few hundred years is full of examples wherein something that was thought to be of purely academic interest, a scientific advance that was believed to have no application whatsoever to any real problem, eventually turned out to have tremendous application. So there are any number of such examples too. So the benefit to society, the importance to society may come about after some time in many cases.
Anybody else would like to answer? Would Professor Mahadevan or any Borges would like to add, or shall I go to the next question?
I think you can go to the next question so we can have a diversity of questions.
The next question is from Namrata Pandit. She says, if we are going to dichotomize biology or life sciences into reductionist or organismal approach of study, where would comparison of molecular traits to construct phylogenetic trees stand? Okay.
Can I take that since this is directly relevant to what I was saying? To Namrata, I would say that there are two ways of looking at your question. One is the narrower question of where would the comparison of molecular traits to construct phylogeny stand. So the distinction between biology at the level of organism or below, or the organism and above, is about the level at which the questions are posed, not so much about the tools that are used or where the data is collected. And in phylogeny reconstruction, the questions that one is interested in are really posed at the evolutionary level, not at the reductionist level, even though many of the tools used and the data collected are collected at the molecular level. So I think this distinction is important to make, that we are talking about this dichotomization based on the level at which your research question is posed, not the tools which you use and the level at which the data is necessarily collected. A slightly broader reaction to this question is that, as I said, the boundaries between the two kinds of biology overlap considerably, just as they do between physics and chemistry. The reason some of us argue that this dichotomization is important is because of how resources get allocated. Imagine if research funding for all the research into the non-living world was dominated only by chemists and there were hardly any physicists making those decisions, then the dispersal of research money would be very uneven and priorities would be very uneven. That is what we are trying to avoid when we say that we should appreciate that sometimes it may be useful to think of this dichotomy between two different kinds of biology.
Sure. So, if any of you wish to add, you can instantaneously just start to add. Otherwise, I'll go to the next question. Where does sex play a role, or what role does sex play in evolution?
Can I say
Maybe I
something?
can. Yeah,
No, it's all.
Mahadevan, go ahead, please.
Yeah.
So the important aspect of evolution is that you should generate variation. And selection has to operate on this variation that's generated. That's how the mechanism of evolution works. So in the case of all sexually reproducing organisms, the most important way of producing these variations is by recombination, process of recombination. And that's what the purpose of sex is. So whenever we have meiosis, which is essential for producing gametes, the two parental chromosomes come together and enact a dance, and they exchange genetic material. And so that when you pass on your genetic information to the next generation, it's not the same what you receive from your parents. So it's like having two decks of cards, and before the cards are passed on to the next generation, this is shuffling of the cards. So this complete mixing. So what the offspring coming from this process, they're different from even though they share the genes, 50% of the genes with the parents, it's a new combination. So that's why it's important that the whole idea sex evolved, because it's still a mechanism for generating variants.
Yeah, I would also like to add that, we talk in evolution about natural selection, that we've been using this word natural selection a lot. Darwin also came up with another type of selection which he termed sexual selection. And here it is, selection, say males choosing females, females choosing males, and then selection even within, or contests within males for females. So Darwin taught a lot about this, and again, as Professor Mahadevan pointed out, all of this is about passing down your genes to the next generation. So that's why sex and having the best combinations also. So sexual selection and natural selection are also very, very important.
Next question. As per the previous studies and as mentioned in the study which have been performed in 2015, it says coronavirus existed back then, but the virulent property was not somehow that strong to cause any such destructive impact. Maybe the virus evolved with time and mutated. Mutation is a very slow process. Where and how can be the developmental mutation set its stability to ultimately create such a pandemic? This is from Sohini Malik.
Right. So yes, viruses have been around for a very, very long time, and even our flu virus is also a type of coronavirus. So we've had, flu. It again depends on how, as I said, aggressive or how fast these. Yes, mutations are at a regular rate, but remember that virus particles, there are so many of them, right? So the probability that you will have a mutation that might then turn out to be virulent can be quite high in, with all the millions and millions of virus particles that are generated. So that's also why it's important for us to keep track of the evolution of these viruses and their hosts. And that's another reason to study virus-host interactions and their evolution much before a pandemic actually strikes us. We need to be always prepared for these kinds of events.
Okay, on to the next question. How have we progressed in answering the question on how living organisms evolved from non-living entities? Do we have any strong evidence from lab simulations? This is from Mr. Satish Kumar.
Mahadevan, do you want?
No, I'll pass. I'll pass.
Oh, okay. He's wanting somebody else to take it. Maybe Professor Amitav Joshi or
Well, I actually have very little interest in how living organisms evolved from non-living things, and that's not an area I really follow or read upon. So I really don't know what the current thinking on that is.
Okay.
Right. I think, yes, we are not really the experts on this, so maybe we will just pass this.
Okay. Yeah. The only thing that the biology textbooks have been speaking of is the Urey-Miller experiment. So
One thing
long
is, I
back.
would say is that maybe the idea of evolution, natural selection can be applied to even to molecules.
Yeah.
So it's believed,
Oh,
the Darwinian idea actually is post generation of the first living thing. So it only explains how diversity was created once the living system inhabited the planet. How that happened, there's some guesswork. So at some point in the past, it must have happened, and how it could have happened, similar mechanism might have been operated. So among many molecules that were there, one molecule that had better ability to self-replicate probably had been over. So over a series of such natural selection events, you can think in terms of life emerging. But Darwin did not address this also. It's quite, I would say, a lot of experiments, people have done experiments on various. The Urey-Miller experiment is one of the most classic ones. People continue to do
yeah.
them, but still don't have. So this is a problem of studying life sciences. We are looking at something that evolved several millions of years ago. So a lot of guesswork has to really dig into the past and see try to. One day we may understand, but at present I don't think we have a complete understanding of how molecules came together to form the
Mechanisms.
living.
Thank you, Professor Mahadevan. The next question: scientists who speak of evolution and its importance among public are very rare in India. At the same time, it's important to make public aware of this theory. So, how do we take a stand on this? Or is it true that scientists who speak on evolution are very rare? Begins there.
Well, I think scientists who study evolution are very rare in India. We are practically an endangered species because of the lopsidedness that I was referring to earlier. You see, if you don't teach something in schools and colleges, if students don't get any appreciation for the fact that this is a field of research which is very active and a field which has indeed undergone a lot of revolutionary changes, just as molecular biology has, then nobody thinks of taking that up as a career. Even those who are planning to go into academic research, they prefer to go into what they perceive as the active areas of research, be it neurobiology or cancer biology or developmental biology or whatever. So this is a problem. I think what is important is to focus upon the fact that evolution is not just important to biology as a discipline, it is also crucial to dealing with almost all the major problems we face as societies that have a biological basis. Professor Renee Borges mentioned some of them. She spoke about cancer. Now, almost 70 years after evolutionary biologists first pointed this out, the oncology community has finally woken up to the fact that a cancer is an evolutionary problem happening within your body as the environmental context. And this has non-trivial consequences for treatment strategies. Darwinian medicine. Another area that, for lack of time, she did not mention is the whole new field of evolutionary psychology, which is shedding a lot of light on many issues of psychological problems and even normal human behaviors. See, human behaviors, just like our ability to digest milk as adults or not, are also largely affected by our evolutionary past. Antibiotic resistance was mentioned. The forensic use of DNA, many of you may have heard of DNA fingerprinting for legal issues and so on. Again, the interpretation
Oh,
is its analysis requires the theory of molecular evolution. So evolutionary biology is really important to be a part of every biologist's training, not just the future evolutionary biologists. The doctors, the
I would
biochemists,
just, yeah,
everybody needs to be trained. Yeah.
I would just like
Sorry, was
to
somebody
add
saying
if there,
something?
yeah,
Yeah.
me, Amitabh, because there are students possibly listening to this, that we have a GATE exam in ecology and evolution, which came about,
Yeah.
everybody knows about GATE, life sciences, GATE, botany, GATE this, but we now have a GATE in ecology and evolution. Funding agencies are taking projects in ecology and evolution very seriously. So I think we are making inroads, and as you correctly said, even the academic community across disciplines are beginning to understand the importance of evolution. So we have a long way to go, but I think there is light at the end of the tunnel.
Thank you, Professor Renee. I think we are running out of time. It's 5:30 now, so we'll have to leave the rest of the questions for some other day. Quick concluding remarks from all of you, and at the end of the session, I would request Professor Amitabh Joshi to recite an English poem. Yeah. So a concluding remark from Professor Renee Borges, and then I'll take it from Professor Mahadevan.
Oh, okay, I think I've really said what I I think really the words of Dobzhansky need to be recited. That nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. So we are products of biology, so we can't understand even ourselves unless we look at it through the lens of evolution. So that's what I would have to say.
Thank you, Professor Renee. Professor Mahadevan, anything in the end?
Yes. So, I mean, what Professor Joshi was saying, that there was a lot of bias in terms of the molecular way of looking at life, but I think things are changing. So I think there's definitely a realization that in order to get a better picture, you need to integrate. Reductionism is good in some ways. It can answer some specific questions. But every time when you go into reductionism, you should always say that it's not, when you cannot add up everything to get the whole. So something is missing when you reduce it to the lowest level. But with that warning, you can still do some reductionist biology. It's useful. But you should always say that integration is always important. Without that, you are not getting the complete picture. So this realization is happening. So with all the genome projects, a lot of data has been generated, but clearly it does not produce the kind of solutions that they promised that they will deliver. So this has dampened the enthusiasm of the receiving public also. So now they think that yes, there's something more than just DNA sequence and or genes in plant. You have to go back into looking at whole organism. But realization has come, and I think it will happen now.
Thank you, Professor Mahadevan. And on to Professor Amitabh Joshi.
Yeah, I completely agree with what Professor Mahadevan just said. I think the change is happening. It's particularly happening in many other countries to a much greater extent already than is yet the case in India. And India also change is happening. And I think we are moving in that direction. We are perhaps a little slow compared to where some other countries are in terms of appreciating how integrative biology is. But yeah, I think there is reason to be optimistic that we are heading towards a much more holistic and integrative way of looking at problems in biology.
Thank you, sir. So we'll conclude the event with Professor Amitabh Joshi reciting an English poem. And also the panel seems to be in one voice appealing the need for study of evolution and a complete change in our outlook on the importance that study of evolution has to be given from the school level, and the importance that the study of evolution should take in our own mindsets as a central problem, the central focus to get an answer to so many more problems that the society faces. So that as a collective appeal from the entire panel to the people who are listening out there, I leave the stage to Professor Amitabh Joshi to end with the poem.
Okay, thank you, Rajani. It's a pleasure to share a poem. I have tried to choose a short poem. I am notorious for writing extremely long poems. So this is going to be very brief. This is a poem entitled "Who Will Grieve the Passing of the Night," and it was written in a slightly different context. But one could also read it in the context of today's discussion that if nobody studies evolution, nobody will be there to grieve when we finally forget all about evolutionary biology, and we should not let that happen. So, who will grieve the passing of the night? When all they have witnessed is light, and none will experience dark forlorn, who will grieve the passing of the night, when all are young and after sunrise born? I can see my future in your dying eyes, from its flickering knowledge no power accrues. Your eyelids a shroud like a cloud in clear skies, from which only shadowy darkness ensues. A cloud that is growing that blots out the light, foreboding of every silver lining shorn. Who will grieve the passing of the night, when all are young and after sunrise born? Will a final memory remorse beget, an imprint deep in unconscious mind, a silent requiem for night that set, a tie reached back in time to bind, a shriek suspended, frozen still, a single phase from wavelet torn? Who will grieve the passing of the night, when all are young and after sunrise born? Baghdad's death 7 centuries long, with bang and whimper entwined close. Regalized rape of the temple of law, with God run rampant the devil froze. A blood drop ruby of the diamond dead, will the crown of an ivory skull adorn? Who will grieve the passing of the night, when all are young and after sunrise born? Who will grieve the passing of the night, when all are young and after sunrise born? Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Amitabh. Yeah, so we'll conclude this session, a wonderful session indeed, something that will be remembered for long. And at 7 o'clock today, there's going to be another panel discussion on the impact of climate change in everyday life with Professor T.V. Ramchandra from the IISC and Mr. S. Vishwanath, the adjunct faculty at Ashoka University, being the panelists. And tomorrow we have a panel session on the role of media in promoting scientific temper. Mr. Pallav Bagla, Ms. Bhagyashree, and Mr. somebody from the Boom Life is going to participate in the discussion. There have been few more questions on the comment section. If some of us have time, we could just type those answers and then leave it on the Facebook page. And thank you for this wonderful session, which began in late noon and is ending in the early evening. Thank you one and all for having been part of this session. With this, we conclude. And tomorrow is the day when India has called for the March for Science. All of you have been listening there can post 1-minute video on why you think science needs prominence or importance, or make a poster, or write a cartoon. Participate in that process of why India March for Science is important from your own homes, and put it up on the India March for Science 080@gmail.com mail. You could mail your responses there. Thank you one and all. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Rajani. Yeah. Can we leave the studio now?
Yeah, I think it's done.